Welcome to Knowledge on the Go, the podcast brought to you by the PI Programs team at Vizient. I'm Margaret Rudisill, Performance Improvement Director here at Vizient, and your host for this podcast. Transitions of care from hospital to post-acute care is both time-consuming and complex. When a safe and efficient transition cannot be arranged, a domino effect takes place. More than 30% of all hospital admissions had a 24-hour delay in discharge due to non-clinical reasons. Poorly managed transitions can cause a cascade of negative events, such as medication errors, readmissions, and delays in treatment. Today, we are exploring how to reduce length of stay, and specifically, we're going to dive in on how to rebalance tasks to improve discharge efficiency. Joining me to discuss his work on task rebalancing is Bennett Masden, Director of Quality at Great River Health in West Burlington, Iowa. Welcome, Bennett.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm glad to be here.
Bennett, you participated in Vizient's Reducing Length of Stay to Improve Capacity Collaborative, and as part of that work, you spoke about rebalancing tasks. What exactly is that?
Whenever you assess a process, you'll find that certain parts of the process are more task intensive. In theory, it's always better to try to level load the task intensivity when looking at a process. Ultimately, that should alleviate some of your resource constraints and deliver efficiency. In our case, we held a 4-day focused improvement event, a Kaizen event that consisted of a cross-functional team. We ensured that anyone that had a stake in that process was included. We took the approach of creating a very rudimentary, basic, and intuitive process map where we outlined the key steps in the process and tried to look at where our tasks landed. In a very intuitive way, we simply drew a vertical dashed line through that process map. Everything prior to that dashed line represented tasks that were occurring prior to the day of discharge, and everything after it represented tasks that were required the day of discharge. And we very quickly saw that the majority of our tasks landed on that day of discharge, which can be a big challenge for our clinicians. We were able to identify several areas where we could effectively rebalance and bump those tasks up earlier in the patient's stay.
What types of tasks can you move, and how did you decide what would be moved?
The primary concern when doing rebalancing, especially in a clinical environment, is that if you're moving some of these tasks up earlier in the stay, it might result in rework. You always like to have an accurate picture of that patient's condition on the day of discharge, so there is a balance there. There is benefit to doing things just in time, but there's also something to be gained if you can move those tasks forward. Be thinking about tasks that you can adjust forward in the stay without resulting in a lot of additional rework.
Well, that's a big deal, and I imagine by moving things around in the schedule puts a kink in people's expectations for what their work is for the day. Did you get any pushback?
Sure. We've received pushback when having this discussion for a number of years. We have suspected that the majority of our tasks required for discharge were happening on the day of discharge, which presents a problem. It goes back to what I mentioned regarding rework. A lot of those functions within the organization were concerned that if they did their tasks prior to the day of discharge, that it would result in duplicate work. We were able to mitigate that concern by offering up changes on a trial basis. Previously, we tried to force function and say, let's go ahead and bump this up to earlier in the stay. We took a little bit different of approach this time around and said, can we embrace this change on a trial basis? Can we assess whether or not this is generating additional rework? And if it does, we're more than happy to abandon that as an idea. The idea behind that is those that are doing the work understand their work, and we should be tapping into that. We should not be forcing function. We should be trying to get commitment to a trial.
So how did you communicate that?
Because our Kaizen event consisted of a cross-functional team, and that consisted of those that were actually doing the work, so frontline staff, and also their leaders, we were able to have everybody on the same page. We developed that action plan together. We committed to those trials together, and at the end of the day, everyone clearly understood what we were going to be trialing.
Can you give us an example of how this played out?
There were a number of tasks that we were able to trial and then successfully put into practice. The primary one that comes to mind is our exercise oximetry test. This has been a known barrier to timely discharge for a number of years, and the pushback was always that we would be doing a duplicate exercise oximetry test because of a change in the patient's condition. We were able to trial that and actually do that the day prior to discharge. That was hugely beneficial, not because exercise oximetry tests themselves were creating delays, but ultimately because the results of those tests tests sometimes require that we get oxygen for those patients prior to discharge. And we were finding that oftentimes oxygen wasn't available at the time of discharge, which resulted in a longer length of stay and us missing our discharge target. So if we do that test the day prior and we have those results dictate that we get oxygen for that patient. We have plenty of lead time to deliver that material and have it ready and have it not be a barrier to discharge.
That's a real win, Bennett. So what other examples do you have? I can't help but think there's some other tasks that you could move.
Medication reconciliation comes to mind. That's another barrier that really stops the show if it's not ready at the time of discharge. We can't effectively discharge a patient until that's completed. Historically, that has been one of the biggest concerns coming from the nursing group, that they're chasing a completed medication reconciliation the day of discharge. And the fact that we had sponsorship from our hospitalist group during that Kaizen event, and they were able to sit through that exercise and see all the moving parts and see all the great work that we were going to be pursuing, it really helped explain the why behind the importance of having that done prior to the day of discharge. It's something that we're reviewing daily during our discharge planning meetings. We're not reviewing it the day of, we're reviewing it in the days prior to that discharge. Seeing better adherence to that expectation has certainly been a lift. I'll continue on about that daily discharge planning meeting. Case management is now proactively looking at a lot of the key barriers to discharge in the days leading up to that discharge. So everybody's really on that same script of looking at our most common and frequent barriers to discharge and ensuring that they're not going to indeed be discharge barriers when the patient is set to leave. I also think about physical therapy. Oftentimes when physical therapy does a consult, they give a formal recommendation to have some sort of physical therapy presence in the home. Typically, we were receiving that recommendation the day prior to discharge, and we found that that was sometimes difficult to swing for a timely discharge the following day. So we're trying to get that completed as early in the stay as possible. And again, that was something that we trialed, doing that proactively versus the day of discharge. And we found that the amount of rework that generated was marginal and was severely outweighed by the benefit that we've gained as a result of making that change.
Bennett, I can't help but think that might improve job satisfaction too when your staff aren't bearing the burden of all those tasks to be done on a single day and in a hurried way on day of discharge. Have you seen that?
We certainly have. The day of discharge is less of a scramble now. There are a few boxes to check, but most of the work has already been done. And I speak for most people in saying that we like to be ahead of the game versus reacting to things the day something's due. So that's been a huge staff satisfier. It's also important to note that we often receive the bulk of our admissions at the same time that we see the bulk of our discharges. So both of those activities compete for the same resources. To be expecting those clinicians to be checking off a long list of boxes the day of discharge is a challenge. And the fact that we've been able to eliminate that has been a huge staff satisfier.
Thank you, Bennett. Can you give us some closing thoughts on how to get started?
Well, I'll go back to ensuring that you're assembling a cross-functional team and that you have comprehensive representation when assessing a process. That is good, sound advice for any sort of PI effort. And don't overthink it. Use some of the most basic rudimentary process improvement tools that we have at our disposal, one being a process map. Line that out with that cross-functional team, ensuring that you get input from everyone. And after you've identified those critical steps, simply put a vertical dashed line that signifies tasks that are required prior to the day of discharge and after the day of discharge. And in our case, we found that was about 70 to 80% of our tasks. And we were able to quickly determine that there was a huge opportunity to rebalance some of those. So I would say take that rudimentary, intuitive, basic approach, and I think you'll be surprised at what it yields.
Well, thank you, Bennett. You've given us a lot to think about today, and we appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Margaret.
Our thanks to Bennett Masden, Director of Quality at Great River Health, for sharing his insights about task rebalancing. And thanks to you for listening. For Vizient's PI Programs team, I'm Margaret Rudisill. Please join us for more Knowledge on the Go podcast. Subscribe today, like us, and send us your comments at picollaboratives@vizientinc.com. Have a great day.